Looks like we're at 21 participants. We'll just give it another minute here, and then we'll go ahead and get started. If folks want to enter their name in the chat box, that would be much appreciated, your name and your affiliation. All right, we've got 24 participants. We're just about 10:02. I think we can go ahead and get started here. My name is Ian Ackamore. I work for the Santa Ana Watershed Project Authority, and I'll be facilitating the meeting today. The title of the meeting is the virtual OWOW, that's One Water, One Watershed, or OWOW stakeholder meeting. And it's particularly focused on this grant funding opportunity that's available to the Santa Ana River watershed region, which I'll explain. I've prepared about 37 slides that I'll be walking through. And I've got 4 different spots where I'll pause to take questions, and it's kind of, they're strategically placed where we can talk about certain things that I've presented in the meeting. I believe everyone's entered the call muted. So you should be able to unmute yourself, and if you're on a cell phone, I think you press *9. That's how you unmute yourself. So I was hoping we would, we would have our dialogue when I have those 4 stopping points. That's when I'll encourage folks to ask questions and everything related to the content that I just presented. And then really once we're through those 37 or so slides, we'll take the rest of the time, and I'll stay on as long as the group wants to answer any follow-up questions. The meeting is scheduled to run from 10 to 12 today, but I can stay on, all afternoon if need be to answer follow-up questions. And it's important to note this won't be the only opportunity to ask questions regarding this funding opportunity. We do have scheduled another meeting, which I'll talk about later, to talk about this and get more input from stakeholders. So this is not your only chance. And of course, you can email me or call me at any time, and I'll have my contact information shown later in the presentation. It's also important to note that this meeting is being recorded, and we will also post these slides on our website. And I will send out, I can send out an email when it's been posted to the group here. So if everybody wants to, if you want, you can enter your contact information in the chat box, and I'll send it out to you as soon as it's posted. But it will be available via a link I will show later in the presentation if you don't get around to sharing your email address. So I think that's all the housekeeping items. Let me start off with the PowerPoint here. Oh, I should also say we also have Sarah Villa from SAWPA staff. She's on the line too, and she'll be helping me monitor when folks have raised hands or have entered chats in the chat box. So we'll address your raised hands and your chats when we get to those pauses, those 4 pauses that I mentioned. So just wanted to highlight that. But here's the first slide. This really shows the agenda of what we'll be talking about. This also was highlighted in the email that you may have received from SAWPA's, we call it the OWOW email blast. It goes out to about 2,000 contacts, but it also highlighted this agenda, which is what we'll cover today. We'll be talking about the updated schedule that the state agency, the Department of Water Resources, has shared for Proposition 1, Round 2, Integrated Regional Water Management Funding, that's IRWM. The review of available grant funding, really, the dollar amounts available for this opportunity, Round 2, and the updated schedule of when those grant funds will be available through the OWOW process, including the grant application process, and then the grant award timeline. Review of possible updates from the Department of Water Resources. That's the state agency that really manages these funds at the state level. that could modify some of the requirements for round 2. And then review of the round 2 rating and ranking criteria, along with the funding categories for small and large projects, as well as disadvantaged communities. So we'll be diving into really how projects will be scored under round 2. But that process hasn't been finalized, as I'll go into, and that's really the main purpose of the meeting, is to get feedback from stakeholders like yourselves. And lastly, like I mentioned, we'll be pausing 4 times throughout the presentation to take input from stakeholders like you. So just to summarize, the real point of the meeting today is talk about funding that's coming down the pike. As you'll hear from me, the funding criteria from the state, and then through this process hasn't been finalized yet. So we're really taking the opportunity through this meeting and a follow-up meeting, and maybe some others if need be, to talk about stakeholder input, what you all would like to see in how projects are scored, and the eligibility criteria. That's really the purpose of the meeting today. So I'll next go into the dollars available and really the schedule for how those dollars will roll out through a grant application and then ultimately an award. So it's important to note, this is integrated regional water management funding, which is broken down geographically across the state of California into what are called funding areas. These funding areas are actually written into legislation, and the legislation that is funding this round is Proposition 1, which was passed by the California electorate in 2014. And one of those funding areas is known as the Santa Ana Watershed Project Authority. That's its formal title. But we really call it, the OWOW region, One Water, One Watershed, or the Santa Ana IRWM funding area. We kind of use those interchangeably. But here on this map, you see, the funding area that we're focused on in this meeting that SAWPA is the lead facilitator for. This is a map of the various IRWM regions in Southern California. So there's one that covers a lot of LA County. There's one in Mojave. There's a small one in San Gorgonio Pass area, Coachella Valley, what we call the Upper Santa Margarita watershed, and then South Orange County. So it's important that your project benefits this funding area, the Santa Ana Watershed Project Authority, or Santa Ana River Watershed that's shown on this map. If you need some mapping help on your project, if you're not sure which area you're in, you can let me know and we can work with you. Even if you don't have any kind of mapping software, we can help you out in determining if your project benefits the Santa Ana Watershed Project Authority or Santa Ana River Watershed. It largely flows, the funding area is really largely around hydrologic boundaries. And there are a bit of, I guess, political boundaries in there too. This line around up here is really the Orange County county line. So it's both hydrologic and then, I guess, political boundaries, kind of combination of the two. And this gets to the amount of funding available for this grant opportunity. If you've been tracking IRWM and the OWOW process, we actually went through the same process back in 2018, I believe, and that was for the round 1 funding. There was approximately 23 million available. Now in round 2 on the right, you can see that there's 27 in total, $27 million available for round 2. These 2 funding rounds total to about $50 million. And we show them in 2 categories, that, that 27 million for round 2 in 2 categories, because these 2 categories are from the state and they're in that Proposition 1 legislation. They have general implementation funding and then disadvantaged community implementation, or DAC implementation funding. So I'll get into the breakdown of those funding, but it's important to keep in mind that general implementation money is really, your traditional IRWM project, and then DAC implementation is also an IRWM project, but it needs to have a direct benefit to an area that's considered a disadvantaged community. I'll get into more of that later. Also to note that we have those two pots of money from the state, but this region has worked with our partners in North Orange County. They're referred to as the North Orange County IRWM group. And we executed an agreement with them a couple years ago where we broke down the total available funding for each of these rounds into geographic pots of funding. So you have your general implementation and your DAC implementation, but we also broke down that general implementation into these pots based on geographic region. So there's a subregion for North Orange County, the upper watershed, and watershed wide. So these three regions still reflect subregions of that total Santa Ana River watershed that I showed on that map. But if your project benefits, the North Orange County region and is contained in their IRWM plan, then you would be applying through their process. They have a process that is managed by one of the public agencies who's involved in that plan. It's the County of Orange Public Works Department. So I believe we have some individuals on the phone from County Public Works. It's Christy Suppies. And we can, if you have questions on that, we can get you in touch with them. But really for this process, we're talking mainly about the upper watershed and watershed wide pots of funding, which represent 60 and 10% of the general implementation funding. And I break down, what those percentages mean in dollar amounts in this pie chart on the right. The total value of the pie chart represents that same 27 million that I showed in those bar charts for round two. So you can see the dollar amounts available for North Orange County in orange there, the watershed wide amount in blue, and the upper watershed amount in green. And what's not calculated in those percentages, those 3 percentages, is the DAC implementation amount. That amount isn't broken down into geographic amounts. That's just the same. That 4 million or so dollar amount is the same amount that I showed in that bar chart. So that that stays the same through this OWOW process. So if you're interested in applying for that DAC implementation funding pot, you would apply through the OWOW process, even if your project takes place and benefits North Orange County or a portion of North Orange County. So like I said, those geographic percentages for those 3 areas were created through an agreement with the North Orange County IRWM group. We will receive OWOW Steering Committee approval, which is the governance board, for the rating and ranking criteria before opening the call for projects to apply for stakeholders to apply for this funding. And then it's important to note, like round 1, there's a local match required under Proposition 1, and that's 50% of your total project costs needs to be provided by local match. And this doesn't apply to DAC implementation as written in Proposition 1. And so we talked about the dollar amounts available. Well, next, here's the schedule for rolling out these dollar amounts through a grant application process, which we call the call for projects, and an eventual agreement. So what really kicked off this schedule for round 1 is that our governing body, the OWOW Steering Committee, approved a Proposition 1 policy that highlights the high scale eligibility criteria for this round 1 and round 2 funding. And I'll get into that in the next slide. But our process this year really kicks off when the state lead agency for IRWM guidelines releases their draft round 2 grant guidelines. And they're saying they're going to release it in August 2021. Now that date may be pushed back, so our process, the OWOW process, would be pushed back. But assuming that they're on schedule and that they release their draft guidelines in August 2021, and we know their scoring criteria, we know their priorities because it's written in their guidelines, we can kick off our process. we'll hold another meeting with the stakeholders. Once those criteria comes out, we'll then bring the OWOW scoring criteria to our governing body in September. Once the steering committee adopts the scoring criteria, we'll then be able to begin the call for projects and allow applicants to apply. Call for projects will be open from August to January. So, into early 2022, there'll still be opportunity to, of course, ask questions during the call for projects. The DWR will then release their final round 2 grant guidelines in December of 2021. That usually doesn't change anything from the draft, but if things do change, we will let stakeholders know and take action that reflects their final guidelines. Once we get projects submitted through the call for projects, we'll close the call for projects in January 2022. SAWPA staff will review the projects for eligibility. Then we'll have a participatory budgeting process that I'll explain, where we select the most competitive projects, the strongest projects that meet priorities of this watershed and score well against the rating and ranking criteria that the steering committee has approved. Once we work with stakeholders in January and February, we'll then bring recommended projects to our board, the steering committee. They'll approve those in March. And then after that, we need to work with those selected projects to develop the final application that goes to Department of Water Resources. So it's important to note that there's like a 2-step application process here. There's the OWOW call for projects application, and then there's the final application to Department of Water Resources. And that needs to be worked on, mid 2022. The OWOW call for projects really mirrors the DWR call for projects, so hopefully minimize work that the local applicants have to do. After we submit projects in September 2022 in a grouped application to the Department of Water Resources, we'll then finalize an agreement in 2023 with Department of Water Resources. And it's at that time the projects have been totally accepted by the Department of Water Resources. So those are the various steps there included in the round 2 schedule. So I mentioned in 2018, our governing body approved a high-level policy document. So what's in that? It has language that states what a project applicant or project proponent must demonstrate about their project, including it will be completed with the active participation of multiple stakeholders and or non-governmental organizations or other stakeholders. It really has to be a collaborative project. Another is it produces a net benefit to the watershed and has no unreasonable negative impacts on others. So for example, it's not taking water from one part of the watershed and giving it to a portion of the watershed. That would be, a unreasonable negative impact on another group of stakeholders in the watershed. It is a sustainable and resilient to changing conditions in the watershed. So it takes into account multi-year droughts, changing conditions from climate change, those sorts of things. Lastly, it provides multiple benefits and includes 2 or more of the following elements on the next slide. And these are those elements or really benefit categories. So these mirror the tenets of the Proposition 1 legislation for this pot of money, that these projects that we're seeking need to be multi-benefit. They need to be integrated and they need to be multi-benefit. So collaborative, but also have more than one benefit. And those benefit categories are listed here. They include water supply reliability, stormwater capture, storage and cleanup, non-point source pollution reduction, removal of invasive non-native species, groundwater recharge, contaminant and salt removal, water banking exchange, and improvement of water quality, multi-purpose flood and stormwater management projects, watershed protection and management, drinking water treatment and distribution, and ecosystem and fisheries restoration and protection. So this is the first of 4 points where I'll stop and see if folks have questions and see if the group has any feedback at this point. Do you have any questions about the Proposition 1 policy adopted by the OWOW governance? Are there any, can you think of any changes that you would like to see to it? I'm not saying that we can necessarily change it, but we love to hear that kind of feedback. And are there any questions regarding the schedule, funding available, and the funding categories, disadvantaged community, general implementation, or the other geographic pots of money that I mentioned? So I'll pause here and see if folks have questions.
Ian, this is Jeff. I have a question for you.
Mm-hmm.
I think you call it the PSP that the DWR is going to come out with later in the fall. Would they provide additional information in there on the criteria that they would be looking for in terms of round 2?
Yes, they will. We'll get into that more in the presentation today, but they'll have their own criteria as well that will be mirroring through this process. Great question. Any other questions before we move on? All right. I'll start the next segment of the presentation, which is the rating and ranking overview
Ian?
and analysis to inform round 2. Yes, sorry, Sarah.
There's a chat from Dan Carney.
Okay,
Is there any indication of what criteria DWR will use to define DAC communities?
Yes, great question. We'll be getting into that later in the presentation too. I have a couple slides on that that'll hopefully help out and discuss that in more detail. I'll pause just for a moment, see if folks have any other questions before I move on. All right, great questions, Dan and Jeff. And Jeff will be covering your question in this next portion. So the rating and ranking overview and analysis to inform round 2. So this is the part of the process that I'll now be covering. I showed that schedule with all the dates on it, and this, to kind of organize everyone's thinking about what I'm covering in these PowerPoints, because there's a lot of detail in here that I'm covering. I show here the focus of what I'm going to cover in the next couple slides. So what we're really focused on now is how your projects get scored, at least in round 1, how they got scored, and how they could be scored under round 2. If, we're still taking feedback from stakeholders at this time. So if folks want to see this process change, now's the time to let us know. But the focus of the next couple of slides is after we open the call for projects, we'll rate and rank the project proponents' questions, projects. So that's the focus. And like round 1, what we currently are thinking we will do, and of course this may change depending on stakeholder feedback and our board's, our governance body's approval, is rank projects through a four-step process. So for IRWM projects, we're encouraging project proponents, and Prop 1 is to submit multi-benefit projects. So we have the benefit categories that we used in round 1 here. There are several, and they all have their own weighting factor. And we had the stakeholders really rank, and then the governing body approve these weighting factors. And those weighting factors come into play in step 3 of this, process to rank projects. So you may have a project where you have water supply reliability, which will be submitted through the call for projects as acre feet. That'll be the benefit numeric value. You may have a project that also has a watershed or ecosystem wetland benefit. You're protecting some wetland or you're building some wetlands. And that'll be inputted by you numerically to represent the amount of acres that you're going to create or benefit. So you'll have some numeric values that you'll enter into that call for projects application. So let's say you have those two, water supply reliability and those acres of wetlands protected. So you're competing with a bunch of other project proponents who have also, let's pretend they all have similar projects to you with those two same benefit categories. Well, what we're going to do is we're going to, in step one, and this is done behind the scenes through Excel, is we identify the max quantity in each benefit class. So one project may have, 2 acre feet of benefits and one may have 100. So we're going to line them all up and compare them. And you're going to get, if you're that 100 project, that 100 acre foot project, you're going to have the max benefit in that first row in the table there. And then that other project is just going to have 2 acre feet. So that step 2 shows how you get the share of the points available. That 100 acre foot project is going to get the total amount of points available through step 2. So they are going to have basically have 100 out of 100 acres, so which is 1. So we'll take their fraction there and multiply it by 20. So really that's the first step in the process, is comparing projects based on each benefit class. They all get a share of the 20 points available. Step 3 is where that weighting factor comes in. So if every benefit class had the exact same benefit factor of say 7, step 3 wouldn't change anything. But since the stakeholders and the OWOW governing board have weighted benefits differently, there is a change to the how your projects get scored. So for the example down here, this is their weighting factor is 7.7. So they are in the let's say the wetland benefit class. So they're getting a fraction of those 20 points multiplied then by their weighting factor. And what we do in step 4 is we sum up for, each project should have at least 2 benefit classes. So if you're in water supply reliability and then ecosystem benefit, we sum up your 2 rows, your 2, the whatever gets worked out in this formula here, we sum up those to form the 2 outcomes from those formulas. And that's your total, weighted score. So what I just explained is kind of shown in this table as well. It just shows for the ecosystem benefit class, 4 projects, they all have a share of those 20 points. Project A is, of course, the high benefit project. It gets the full 20 points. Then it gets those 20 points get multiplied by the weighting factor of 7.7. So you can see the values come out, pretty differently. It's all based on the amount of that 20 points you get and then the weighting factor. So we get weighting scores across the board. So one question we were thinking about as we begin round 2, at least internally, was this process, was it a good process that really had a wide range of scores? It wouldn't have been the best process if everyone scored really well. Everyone was getting A's or everyone was really getting F's, in their final project scores. So we looked at the distribution of weighted scores, that's those final scores, of the Prop 1 Round 1 projects. And we had about 28 projects. And here's a histogram that shows the distribution of those scores. And as you can see, it's largely a bell curve, and a lot of projects scored in the middle there, 200 to 400. And then we had a couple projects that scored near the top, and that kind of makes sense because, a lot of, we have those distributions already working behind the scenes with the raw scores of where each project gets a share of those 20 points. So that this bell curve, further enforces that, the raw score and then the final weighted score is working pretty well for round one and the 28 projects that we had. And then to Jeff's question, how does this process line up with DWR's PSP? That's their proposal solicitation package or their grant guidelines. They're going to be releasing that, and they're going to have their own grant scoring criteria. So we want to make sure, and that's why we're not finalizing our grant rating and ranking criteria this afternoon. We're going to wait till DWR proposes theirs. We are going to, really mirror where we can their rating and ranking criteria. And that's where you can see just some examples in this table here. On the left is OWOW's rating criteria from our round one process. And you can see we have, benefit category and that weighting factor in parentheses there for a water quality type benefit. And then the second row is really disadvantaged community type project benefit. And you can see on the right column where we're kind of mirroring their process. They provide points, usually 1 point for each of their what they care about or their criteria. So you can see on the right, there's one that's focused on some priority water quality contaminants like perchlorate and arsenic. And then the bottom row represents very similar to the SAWPA OWOW process, focused on disadvantaged community, but also EDAs. I think it's, I can't quite remember what that stands for, but it's another type of DAC area, and then tribal areas. So some other things to point out, for this reason, like I mentioned, that the OWOW criteria and the call for projects are not finalized until DWR publishes their draft PSP and priorities, so we know what's in the right column. So now moving on, we're now going to be talking about some of the Prop 1 Round 1 OWOW criteria that the OWOW process used for our funding that we rolled out in round one, and see if stakeholders have any feedback on it. What the stakeholders in OWOW governance group approved for round one was they wanted to encourage small projects to compete on a level playing field with other small projects. So what we're thinking internally is to continue that forward for round two, but we'd love to hear from you. What was done under round two or round one was we split up the amount of funding that small projects could compete for and large projects could compete for. And it was done, small projects had 10% of the funding available, and then large projects had 90% of the funding available. So you can see what that same 10 and 90 split would look like using the available funding we have for round two, which is about 18.5 million. So that would be 1.9 million available for small projects and 16.7 million for large projects. And the way we've defined small and large projects, we could define it any way, but the way we did it under round one was to cap them at their grant request. So if they requested 500K or less, they were considered a small project. And if they requested anything above 500K, they were considered, a large project. So that's their grant request. That's not their total project cost. So one question we had internally, was that 500K large project and small project cap, driving maybe, the type of projects and the dollar amounts that project proponents were requesting. And you can see in this histogram again, this shows the grant request. So the amount of funding that project proponents were requesting in round one, and again, there are about 28 projects. There are a lot around the 500K and less range, but there were also a lot grouped around $5 million. So this 500K cap didn't totally drive project proponents and what projects they were submitting. but it probably did some to some degree in some instances. Some additional notes on final funding amounts. So, 28 projects submitted projects, 28 project proponents submitted projects in round one, and ultimately 10 projects were funded. And their grant amounts ranged from 297K to about that $5 million amount. So an average of 2.2 million. And those funding amounts, and we'll get into this later, were decided through that participatory budgeting process, and we'll describe that in more detail. But getting back to the small, the small project cap, we also were wondering, and we analyzed the dollar amounts that project proponents were requesting. Was the 500K in grant that they were requesting, was that their total project costs? Was that going to cover all their project costs? Was that going to make or break their project? And for the majority of these small projects, and we got about, you can see about 10 of them submitted. The majority, 6 of them did, the amount of grant they were requesting totally covered their total project costs. So that it just reiterates that this cap is important. This 500 cap is important because it's in some ways driving how much they're requesting and how big or how small their project is going to be. So I will pause there. I have another segue slide here, but I don't think I have any questions that I've pre-generated, but I will pause there and see if the group has any questions related to the small and large projects or any of the other criteria we talked about. I just covered the rating and ranking criteria. We covered the weighting process and the raw score process, that share of 20 points. So I'll pause there and see if the group has any questions before I move on to the participatory budgeting process.
Ian, we have a question on the chat from Mark McReynolds.
Mm-hmm.
How does one figure out acreage for invasive removal?
You would usually, through your planning of your project, figure out the extents of the area you plan to focus on. And your extents may be driven by property ownership, or maybe you want to focus on a watershed, or a portion of a watershed. So you would have to do some type of mapping. It can be a combination of parcel mapping, ownership, as well as watersheds that you're focused on. Or maybe it's a service area of an entire public agency, or maybe you have a nonprofit that has a service area and you want to focus on their area. So you would want to plan out the total acres that you're going to focus on in your project, map it out, and then turn it into an acre value. And then what we'll also accept through the call for projects, or what we plan to accept, is the map of this benefit area that you plan to focus on. There'll be probably a GIS tool where you can really draw on a map where your focus area will be. But you really doing that mapping ahead of time will make your proposal a lot stronger, because through the participatory budgeting process that I'll explain, we'll be asking project proponents, well, how did you come up with that benefit area? What type of mapping did you do? So it really behooves you to really plan out your project beforehand and really articulate your benefit area. Any other questions before I move?
Yeah, Ian, on that question, when you say, or let me ask it this way. Would it be, so you're removing invasive species that presumably would result in a water savings? Is the idea that you would calculate the water savings based on the amount of invasive species that that would be removed?
Yeah, my example, I was just focused on an invasive species that may not provide water benefit, a water savings benefit. But if you're removing an invasive species that uses a lot of water, and you have literature, science-based research that shows that there is a water savings benefit for that species you're removing, you can also include a water savings benefit. And you'll do that in another benefit category, water conserved, or acre supply of water created. So a project like that, where you're removing invasive species that may provide, a habitat value, but then it's also saving water, you would have two different values you would enter. You would enter for the first one, acres, and then the second one, acre feet for water supply saved. Any other questions before we move on?
Real quick question. This is Kevin from OCWD, and I had to step off briefly, so I apologize if this was already addressed, but is the same scoring criteria also applied for the DAC benefits as well, or is it a separate scoring?
It's the same formula, the same scoring formula.
So then the follow-up question to that would be, if a benefit to a DAC is not a quantifiable or comparable, I guess. As an example, for the last round, we created a field trip program for DAC community schools. I guess the question is there like a template that we follow to create some sort of a quantifiableness to that, or is that kind of left to everyone's own discretion?
You would have to, for that, you would have to provide some type of numeric benefit. It sounds like it's an educational project, and you would have to quantify the amount of benefit that you're providing, and if it's education, you kind of have the leeway to estimate the amount of units that you're educating. So it's schools or students, or or maybe it's school districts that you're working with. So you have some leeway to create that. But I will say that under Proposition 1, it has DWR, the Proposition 1 language, is looking for implementation projects. So you aren't able to submit for a whole, just a single educational project. That was allowed, I believe, under Prop 84, but under Proposition 1, it needs to have an implementation, component. It can't just be, education based. You can have an education component, where you have maybe a water supply project, and then you, as a part of that, you have an outreach plan to educate members of, such and such group. But this is implementation funding, and they're single educational projects is not currently not being solicited by under Prop 1. That may change slightly, and we may get more guidance about that from DWR, but that's largely what we heard under Prop 1 and what we've been hearing to date from them.
Thanks, Ian.
Any other questions? All right, well, I'll move into the participatory budgeting segment, which is the next step in the process for the OWOW call for projects after we do the math and rate and rank the projects. So this relates to kind of everyone's projects or everyone's questions that they asked Jeff, the other chat box question, and then Kevin's question as well about, we'll be asking for your numeric benefits. And it's important that they're not wild guesses, that they're, educated guesses based on, what partners you have lined up. So if they're school districts, and that's what you're counting, that you have, partner list, and there's been some pre-planning done with those school districts, or if it's a ecosystem project that you've done, mapping, you've figured out your own land ownership, you can actually get access to the property. It's not just a railroad corridor where you have less likely to get access. So it's important you do your homework before you submit a project, because you are going to go through this participatory budgeting process where fellow stakeholders and SAWPA staff will ask questions about, okay, well, how did you come up with those numeric benefits that you entered into the call for project application form? As a recap, after and under round one in the participatory budgeting process, there were several workshops, or about 3, and those were where the participatory budgeting was done. And the goal of those 3 workshops was, like I said, goal of transparency, objective, and deliberation, to make sure everyone was using similar ways to estimate their benefits. And the purpose was to receive input on the projects proposed in the OWOW process. I asked questions like, is the project eligible for OWOW and Proposition 1 funding? Are the benefits claimed realistic? Is the watershed improved without an unreasonable expense or detriment to others? And does your project include the active participation of multiple agencies, stakeholders, or NGOs? In under round one, those benefit areas, so the acreage of wetlands you're creating, or the that benefit area to your disadvantaged community, that was the main part of the conversation under round one. So I wanted to highlight that again as we move into round two. Most of our discussion in those 3 workshops we had in round one was focused on, are you estimating your benefit areas similar to how another project proponent would do it? And that largely affected 2 benefit classes, because these 2 benefit classes here, benefits to members of DACs and benefit a large area of a watershed, are really driven by your benefit area and your mapping and the amount of partners you're claiming, or the amount of parcels that you'll be able to benefit or enter into. So when we did round one, some project proponents used different ways to estimate their benefit areas. There are a lot of assumptions that went into them. And what we landed on at the end of round one was these certain these rules that we had the project proponents use, which was if you are estimating an ecosystem project, you're using these sub-watersheds known as hydrologic unit codes, or HUCs. And at the HUC 12 level, there's different HUC levels that they use. HUC 12 level watersheds is kind of a medium-sized watershed. So when project proponents were estimating their benefits for ecosystem projects, at the start of round one, they were using different assumptions and kind of different benefit areas. So we landed on everyone, really using HUC 12 boundaries, so we could compare apples to oranges in that benefit class. And then for the benefit class of surface water quality and groundwater quality, we also used HUC 12 watersheds for water quality. And then for groundwater projects, we used these common groundwater basins that have been developed through the Department of Water Resources, called DWR 118 groundwater basins. They're kind of like HUC 12s, where they're basically approved by an outside government agency. USGS is the outside agency for HUC 12s, and then for groundwater basins, it's Department of Water Resources. So those were the 2 benefit area boundary lines that we used for those 3 classes. But we also got 1 or 2 coastal water quality projects, and it also had a recreational component. So that, coastal water quality, unlike groundwater quality, that's a surface water body. There's a recreational benefit to it. So the group decided on, really drawing the buffer area, 10 miles out from the coastline of that, watershed that the project was in. And then similarly for inland park or water body recreation buffer area, that the group settled on one half-mile buffer area. So, smaller buffer area than, a whole coastline, which has people, the logic there was stakeholders, users will commute further to use a coastal resource as opposed to a smaller recreational body that's inland. So you can see as an example here in this map that we have a project that has a construction footprint along the Santa Ana River in the upper watershed. That construction is being done, let's say, in the stream. And it's a project that's going to benefit water quality in the downstream area. So what a project proponent would do is they would map out, the river downstream of the construction footprint, and they would stop at some logical point that would make sense for their type of benefit. So here we have the dam here. So if they're benefiting fish, if this project is done to benefit fish in the Santa Ana River, a dam may prevent fish from moving downstream if there's not a fish ladder or some type of fish transport program. So the logical way to demonstrate your benefit for this type of project is to use major barriers and then the downstream corridors from your construction footprint. So this is, one example that highlights how we are just starting the discussion about how project proponents would quantify their benefits in round two. We're thinking about creating some resources that would help explain this a bit. We didn't have that in round one, but we're thinking about having that a bit in round two. And we'd love to hear from you about what type of projects you have so we can start thinking about these, explaining how you would submit your projects. Because there are a lot of different types of projects out there. There's a lot of different ways to make assumptions about your benefit area. But we hope that these kind of limits, these Huck 12s, these groundwater basin limits, these buffer areas for surface water projects or recreational projects will help project proponents map out their benefit areas, because those benefit areas are important. They help score your project. You're eventually going to have to enter some numeric value in the OWOW call for projects form and then submit it or then go through the participatory budgeting process. And then moving on, so as a final part of the participatory budgeting process, after we determine the final weighted scores of those projects that we're all using the same methodology for developing their benefit areas, we created a list of those weighted scores of those final projects, and then allocated funding, or we recommended to the stakeholders that we allocate funding proportionally based on their share of the top weighted scores. So we also cap the top projects that we distributed funding to proportionally based on a very clear break in the weighted score. So you can see there's a clear break from kind of the high 200s to the 400s for the weighted scores. So that clear break allowed us to draw a line and say the top 5 projects are going to get grant funding. And the amount of funding dollars that they got was their share of the total value of the weighted scores here. So not the total value of all weighted scores, it was the total value of those top 5 projects weighted scores. So that's what we did in round one. It worked out pretty well. We recommended it to the stakeholders and then the OWOW governing body, and that's what they approved. But of course, we'd love to hear from you all and see if there are any other methodologies that we should consider when really recommending those final grant dollar amounts. So I'll pause there, see if the group has thoughts on the OWOW Prop 1 Round 1 process, rating and ranking criteria, your thoughts on the OWOW final grant funding amount process, and then possible updates to the OWOW criteria. Does the group want to recommend changing the small project threshold of 500K? We can also talk about changing that 90 to 20 split. We can also talk about changing the weighting factor of the benefits. If there's a strong desire to change those weighting factors, maybe things have changed in the watershed, we can also consider that. And then if the group wants more formal guidance on benefit area limits, we can talk about that. And if you want to throw out project ideas you have, we can start thinking about what guidance we would give your project. So I'll pause there and see if stakeholders and those on the line have questions or feedback. All right, I'll just hang on a couple more seconds here, see if anything comes to anyone's mind. I know I covered a lot here. All right, well, I'll move on here. If you have any other questions, we can come back to this in the next breaking point. All right, so the next segment is update on the latest information from the Department of Water Resources regarding Prop 1 Round 2. And so this is the portion of our process that I'll be covering. So, we've been talking a lot so far about the call for projects and the OWOW process and rating and ranking and participatory budgeting. So we're still going to be talking about that. We're still going to be talking about rating and ranking criteria, because our rating and ranking criteria, of course, have to complement the DWR guidelines. But we're also going to be talking about DWR's process, and their process, continues after, we have a final ranked list that's approved by the OWOW governing body. So I've got some updates to share. They had a meeting with everyone who was interested in IRWM, I think about a month and a half ago. So we have some details to share that really informs their process after the SAWPA and the successful project proponents submit their application. So here's the updates from DWR. They under round 1, they had a pre-application workshop. So before SAWPA worked with the project proponents to submit an application to DWR, they said, a pre-application is required. So each project proponent, we had 10 of them, they presented their projects and their benefits to DWR and some State Water Board staff who were in the room, and DWR, and provided some project proponents and SAWPA to look into things more before a final application was submitted. They are saying that will be optional at this point. So that's some news there. In terms of new guidelines or new priorities from the state that they're going to be promoting through their point system, their grant application point system in the proposal solicitation package is climate resiliency. That's something that they are going to be highlighting, and we don't know what that'll look like yet, but that's something that they will be focusing on. Folks who have been tracking the governor's budget know that climate resiliency is a big priority for the governor's office right now, as well as the legislature. They'll also be working on clarification of direct benefit to DAC to ensure stakeholders know if their potential project is eligible. We had a question on that earlier. How do you determine if your project is a DAC project? So I'll talk about that more. But DWR is promising to define that better in the round 2 proposal solicitation package. They're also, unlike round 1, they're going to have 2 application deadlines. It's preliminary at this point, but that's what they're leaning towards to DWR. So we could submit an application in March of next year or September. As you can see in my schedule that I showed earlier in the PowerPoint, we're going to plan on submitting an application in September. It would be very difficult to meet March. And then there's also always, and they highlighted this in their meeting about a month and a half ago, that there's a potential for the governor and the state legislature to add additional grant requirements based on major policy issues, such as responding to drought emergencies. The governor has declared a couple of drought executive orders for a couple counties, Northern California. So, responding to drought may be a priority, and you may get more points in the PSP, but more is to be seen. We don't know what that'll look like at this point. So getting into that DAC benefit area issue, I'm focusing on that in the next couple slides, because there wasn't a lot of guidance on that from the DWR PSP in round 1. So I want to make sure that we discuss this early and often in this round 2 process. So as a recap, in round 1, there were 2 different methodologies to quantify your disadvantaged community benefit area. In DWR, what they utilized was you could count the disadvantaged community area within a construction footprint area. So maybe just where you're building something, a well, and the parcels that well falls on, or a larger benefit area, where that well water is going. So you can use both. And if there is no, economic data that allows you to map disadvantaged communities in those parcels that you want to focus on for your project, you are able to do a median household income survey. That's what MHI stands for, to quantify the income levels and articulate to SAWPA and DWR that your community members are indeed disadvantaged. And median household income is important because that is how disadvantaged communities are defined under Proposition 1. That's what they use. I believe it's 80% of the median household income is what's used for Proposition 1. DWR also has a GIS mapping tool that highlights all the parcels that have those median household income levels. So that's available to project proponents, and we can put a link on that on our website. But it's important to note we're not using something like CalEnviroScreen or another method to define disadvantaged communities. So it's really income driven, and that household income data really comes from the census and I believe the American Community Surveys. So it's really driven by those survey data. But if you don't want to, or if you'd like to utilize other data, or if you have a project that's focused on an area with limited data, you can always do your own survey, and there's parameters in the guidelines from DWR on how to do those surveys. If you have questions on that, I can talk to you offline. But the purpose of the project, or the purpose of DWR's process, is to determine if a project is eligible for a waiver of cost share. That 50% cost share is required unless you are able to articulate your project benefits disadvantaged communities. Or also, if your project is eligible for receiving all or a share of that DWR disadvantaged community implementation funding, that purple slice of the pie chart that I showed earlier. So there's 2 purposes of that DWR disadvantaged community process. And then for the OWOW process under round 1, we really utilize the disadvantaged community benefit mapping to determine what your benefit area was. And that was used to really drive the scores in that best benefit member area benefit class. So we didn't, but before I go on, it's important to highlight that DWR will hopefully articulate this more in the round 2 guidelines, but under round 1, it's important to note what they're looking for in benefits to disadvantaged communities is not just benefits like a water quality body that disadvantaged community members live nearby and recreate on. They, under Proposition 1 language, what they are looking for is a disadvantaged community project where it really creates some type of benefit to community members who are living on those parcels. So it's important to look at, if your parcels are residential or not, They're really looking for water supply projects, projects that protect properties from flood control, projects that protect water quality on parcels, septic to sewer is okay. Other projects that improve infrastructure related to supplier quality, or projects that protect habitat and quality of recreational water bodies are not as competitive because the general public enjoys those benefits. So that's why it's important to really focus on if your project is benefit residential, parcels, and not just, water bodies or areas that the general public enjoys. That's how DWR is really interpreting Proposition 1. So it's important to note that. So there was potential issues with the past DAC definition under round 1. OWOW allowed project proponents to claim open space areas like surface water bodies and the river bottom as a direct benefit to DAC. This was done to encourage project proponents to think regionally and find interlinkages with other potential project partners. So it's still okay to do this, the same process through OWOW that was done under round 1. But a possible change to the OWOW process could be done to mirror the DWR methodology, as DWR interpreted direct benefit to DACs very specifically, where you can only claim benefits to end-use customers in really non-open space parcels. So we wanted to lay out the pros and cons of changing at least the OWOW definition. We can't change how DWR interprets things, but we can change how, the OWOW process really advertises for DAC benefits. So we could change it to exactly mirror what DWR is doing, really focus on residential parcels. And the pro of that is no confusion later in the process for project proponents when DWR does their analysis, the final application, and it incentivizes projects to mirror the goals of Prop 1 legislation. The con, though, with mirroring DWR is it could make the OWOW application complicated, as the benefit areas created via OWOW project portal, that's a mapping process, and the call for projects that I mentioned are currently drawn regardless of parcel type, but we're investigating a GIS fix to the portal. And it also doesn't incentivize project proponents to think as regionally. Through round 1, we were really incentivizing project proponents to think about, okay, how does your DAC project really benefit this corridor, the surface water body or the river bottom or stream bottom. So I will pause there and see if there is any feedback from stakeholders. Talked about a number of things, talked about DWR updates, and then really drilled into disadvantaged community benefit area definitions that DWR and OWOW used. And we'll see if project proponents want to see the OWOW definition change for round 2. So I'll pause there and see if there are any questions.
Ian, this is Kevin again from OCWD. Is there a % threshold of direct benefit to DACs that are required to apply for a DAC grant? Like 50% or 75% of the benefit would be on DAC residential parcels, or is it 100%, or where does that kind of fall? Is there any clarity on that front?
Yeah, under round 2 or under round 1, there were some percentages. I think it was 25, 50, 75, and 100. And to get your cost share waiver, you had to meet a certain threshold. I think it was something like 50%. And then to get access to that funding pot, I think it was something like 75%. So we'll make those percentages known, and I can in the next presentation I can go over those percentages and what was used under round 1.
Great. And you don't foresee those changing? I
don't know. It's tough to tell what DWR will do. I don't want to take a wild guess. I'm just not sure. They haven't talked about it changing So I imagine it won't, but you know, it could all depend. So.
Sounds good. Thank you for clarifying.
Mhm. Great question. Any other questions on what I've covered so far, or anything else? If you have any questions earlier on the presentation that I covered earlier, feel free to ask. All right. Well, this is the last of the presentation here. I'm just going to talk about next steps. Where do we go from here? Well, we're going to take feedback from this meeting and share it with the OWOW governance. We have a meeting with the OWOW steering committee on July 22nd, so next month. So I will share any feedback from this meeting and share it with them, and also share with them, you know, what I covered here. We talked about the, you know, the histograms and distribution of projects in there, and how the weighting and ranking criteria. So we talked about that with the OWOW steering committee a bit at the last meeting, but we'll talk about it with them at their next meeting on July 22nd. We'll hold another OWOW virtual workshop just like this on August 26th and get additional feedback from stakeholders. I'll probably tee up a lot of the similar issues that we talked about today and ask if there's any other feedback. I'll present you know, additional things like those DAC percentage thresholds that I talked about. So we'll dive into a bit more depth on some items where there seemed to be interest, and then hopefully DWR will have some more breadcrumbs of where they're going with their round 2 PSP. So I'll highlight those for the group. Then we'll take all the stakeholder feedback as a final recommendation to the steering committee and SAWPA board on September 23rd and October 4th. And then we'll open the call for projects, like I mentioned, in October, and then close it in January of 2022. I mean, that can change if DWR delays the release of their PSP, or if there's like wild policy changes in the PSP from round 1. I think we'd want to make sure the project proponents, potential ones, understood those before we open the call for projects. So, you know, October to January is what we're shooting for the call for projects, but we will let everyone know through OWOW email blast that is being pushed back. And we also have our website available. So those are the next steps. These are the contacts here at SAWPA. If you have any questions, like I said again, my name is Ian Ackamore. My manager is Mark Norton. You know, this is our contact information here. So I will pause there. I think that's my last slide. Yep, 37. I will pause there and see if there are any questions before we close today. We've got plenty of time. It's only 11:13, so happy to hang on as long as possible if the group has any other questions. So I'll hang out a bit here, see if anyone has any questions.
Hey, Ian, this is Chris. I had a quick question for you.
Yeah. Hey, Chris.
So, like Prop 1, you know, there was definitely the implementation component, but you could use some of the funding on, you know, the planning process if it was done at a certain point throughout the grant timeline. Is that basically the same thing, round 2?
Yes, you're talking about doing CEQA and maybe a feasibility study as part of your planning process.
Sure. Yep.
Yeah, if it's related to the project that you're going to do, yeah, you can invoice for it. There's going to be, you know, a cost share date, and then there's going to be a grant eligibility invoice date for this. So you'll have to keep in mind, like, do you want, you know, grant fundings to pay for it, or are you okay with just going for it? So, but yeah, if it's related to the project, you know, CEQA, you know, NEPA even, and then your feasibility study. So
there has to be some sort of like implementation that occurs during the grant timeline, right? Okay.
yeah, it has to be related to that CEQA and NEPA. related to those planning documents that was done.
Cool, thanks.
Mhm. And while folks are thinking of more questions, I'll show where on our website you can find out all about OWOW. So you go to our work. This is the SAWPA.org main page. You go to our work, and then OWOW is there. And then there's a number of options. You can see the OWOW plans, OWOW governance body, grant funded activities, what's been funded to date. And then future funding opportunities is the page where we are, putting items related to round 2. So I'll post this presentation here. I'll work with our webmaster to do that. But, that's where we'll have items related to this call for projects. Once the call for projects will start, it will be linked off this page. You can learn about the projects for round 1 here, sign up for the OWOW mailing list, and then view our projects on the GIS viewer. We'll also use that same GIS viewer in the call for projects for round 2. So if you want to get familiar with that, that's a good place to go. But I'll enter this URL too in the chat box for everyone. Any other questions?
One more quick one for you, Ian. This is Chris again. Hey, if we have a project that might span some of the different jurisdiction you had, like the SAWPA jurisdiction gets, for example, to the crest of the San Bernardinos, if there's a project that was maybe going to be in the mountains that spans some of the jurisdictions over to the Mojave side or the San Gorgonio, for example, would we apply to just like the SAWPA the OWOW thing, or would it go to one of those other jurisdictions? How would you envision that happening, or is that just not a good idea?
No, it's been done in the past in our watershed even. You would apply to both. So you would have to work with both regions. They may, the other region may have their own call for projects. And what was done in the past is we coordinated our grant applications to DWR. So the 2 regions work together. So depending on what your project is like, we could do something like that. But you'd want to get in touch with, both SAWPA and the other region, and start thinking about how you would split out your benefits, because your grant money and benefits would be tracked in each region. The Prop 1 legislation is very funding area region driven. So you would have to start thinking about, okay, how much grant are you going to request, and how many benefits are you going to claim for each one, for each region. So we can talk about that more offline, and we can even get in contact with the other region that you're thinking about submitting to, and making sure that they have a process and timeline that mirrors ours to make it as easy as possible on you. So yeah, great question.
Sounds good, thanks.
I put the URL in the chat box for everyone. So the website URL is in there. Any other questions before we go? Or any other feedback? Does the group want to recommend anything, or hear about anything before they recommend anything? I talked about the weighted factors, those benefit classes that get different weights. Does the group want to talk about those more, or recommend that they get re-ranked? That's something certainly we can talk about. Or does the group like those 10% and 90% break between small and large projects? Does anyone have any, does anybody want to talk about their project right now and, now it's always a good thing to do right now in the process, talk about it early so we can talk about as a group, okay, like does the small, large project funding threshold make sense for your project? Does it help? Does it hurt you? Are there things we can do differently? So happy to hear from anybody about their project right now if they want to do that or recommend anything for that we specifically talk about in our next meeting.
Ian, we have Commissioner Bruce Whitaker with the raised hand.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Yes, Commissioner, you have a question?
Yes, just a general comment. I thought you did a very well-rounded presentation that left little for me to question at this point. So I think it was an exceptional job of leading this discussion. I certainly don't have any projects to talk about at the moment, but I do appreciate your presentation. I think it was very enlightening for me.
Great, yeah, thank you very much, Commissioner. Yeah, I appreciate you attending and providing this feedback. Really appreciate it. Well, great. Well, if there's no other questions, feel free to call or email me if you want us to focus on additional things for our August. I believe it's August 23rd, I said. We'll also make this recording available on our website. As I mentioned, this is being recorded, so we'll make it available. But if there's no other questions, everybody have a great rest of your Thursday, and we'll see you in 2 months.
You too. Thank you, Ian.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you,
Take care.
Sarah.